So good afternoon, Fighting Scots. My name is Jordan Sharpie Lencioni. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Engagement here at Monmouth College. I want to welcome you all this evening for our next Golden Scots event, the 17 Men at the Center Seat, Their Courts and Their Times with Dan Cotter, class of '88. We're so thrilled that you're all able to join us this evening. Before we begin, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's event will be recorded and available on the Monmouth College website next week. For the best viewing experience during tonight's presentation, please ensure that you are in speaker mode, which can be selected in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Attendees will be able to ask questions throughout the event in the chat, and then at the end, we'll go ahead and open up the room so that you can show your video, your audio, and have questions and conversation with Dan. At the end of the event, you'll also see a short 3-minute survey pop up in your web browser, and you'll receive a more comprehensive survey next week once the Golden Scott celebration has concluded. Now for a little bit about our presenter. Dan Cotter, class of 1988, was an accounting major at Monmouth College, where he played football and was the head resident at Gibson. Dan currently serves as a member of the Board of Trustees and is the chair of the Audit Committee. He went on to receive his Juris Doctor from the John Marshall Law School, which will be renamed the University of Illinois Chicago Law School, effective July 1st of this year. He was summa cum laude in 1995. Dan provides legal advice to his clients in a wide range of industries, including fitness, consulting, and insurance. Throughout his career, he had leadership roles in both the bar and legal institutions, having served most recently as president of the Chicago Bar Association. As a hobby, Dan often writes and speaks on the founding of the nation, the Supreme Court, and the Constitution. And in April 2019, his book, The Chief Justices, the 17 Men at the Center Seat, Courts and Their Times, was published. He writes a weekly column, Cotter's Corner, for the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin, and is co-host of a podcast, the Podium and Panel Podcast. Dan, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Jordan, and welcome Golden Scots to tonight's event. And I'm sure we all want to be in person rather than doing Zoom, but hopefully the end is near and the light's at the end of the tunnel. Golden Scots has been something that's been familiar to me for many years. Back in the 1990s, when I was on the alumni board, I was asked to investigate and start to prepare for moving some of the classes from homecoming, giving congestion on campus and the inability of people to really sit and visit with each other, and turn it into a summer event, which became Golden Scots. And won't go into details here, but at the beginning, there was a lot of letters and consternation and pushback saying, what the hell are you guys doing, destroying the homecoming and the environment. But anyway, I welcome you to the Golden Scots. And again, I hope this is the last time that we have to do these things virtual. I know that it's getting old for all of us. And so thank you for joining me on a Friday night. And I hope you have a beverage of your choice. And we're going to talk about the Supreme Court and the 17 men at the center seat, their courts and their times. We'll talk about why a book, and we'll take a look at the court and the process. We'll talk about the history of the court a little bit, dark money that's involved in it, and the current court and some developments and where we're at today with the Roberts Court as it's known. And as Jordan mentioned, at any time, if you have questions, please submit them. And I also want to give a shout out to Jim Wilson if he's watching tonight. Jim and I have gotten to know each other as fellow authors at Monmouth. I saw that he had published a book about Winston Churchill's visit to the White House, and we became friends. And I want to thank Jim for helping out one of my colleagues from our Peoria law office. His niece was in the process of trying to publish a book, and Jim was very helpful and introduced her to a publisher. And last week, or this Tuesday, I think it was, the book was published. And so thank you, Jim, for that. So there's, you can see a little bit behind me, but this is a Constitution at my fingertips. This is when I sit at home. And since the pandemic, my wife found this beautiful bookcase and desk. And so those are all books about the Constitution and the Supreme Court of the United States. That's my library upstairs that has hundreds of books as well. In the middle shelves are history, non-SCOTUS, and the books on this shelf are all Supreme Court. Yeah, we have a problem, and we've gotten rid of some, but we keep getting more. So as mentioned, I write a column for the Daily Law Bulletin, and there's my book, The Chief Justices. So why the book? Why do this? And this is from the book, and I'm not going to quote from the book or read from the book tonight much, but this is on page Roman 22 to 23, and it kind of explains what I was going through. I graduated from Monmouth in 1988. I started law school in 1991, and as we all learn and talk about is from Monmouth, that it teaches us how to think, and that we become lifelong learners, intellectually curious. You probably have heard those terms or use those terms about the magical place that is Monmouth College. It's near and dear to all of us, and that we learned there. And what happened was, we get to law school, we go from case to case, class to class, and professors spend little or no time on jurisdiction where the case was decided, the judges who wrote the opinions, what were the societal factors that may have weighed in on the decision, what was the background of it, what was the times like. For example, one of the cases that was handled by the Supreme Court during the Truman era was the steel seizure cases, and that was during the Red Scare and during the Korean War. And so many students really not paying attention to that. And so I really was starting to ask questions and thinking about the founding of our nation, the Supreme Court, and figure out a little bit about the background of these people that are in robes. And eventually it led to me investigating the Chief Justice position, of which there have been 17, and we'll talk about those people momentarily. The last term of the Supreme Court, before the term, so the Supreme Court of the United States from October, the first Monday in October through the next first Monday in October is a term. And so this is the October 2020 term that's being in the process right now. There's about 20 cases that have yet to be decided by the Supreme Court. Before that happened, though, as we all know, the notorious RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, died on September 18, 2020. And we started getting into the politics behind the Supreme Court, the fight that transpired over Garland in 2017, and things of this nature. There's a lot of talk, and one of the things I talk about it in the book and have written about extensively is the Biden rule. This was in 1992. It was right after Clarence Thomas's tense hearings and confirmation process. And this was before an election. And what Biden said was that 6 Supreme Court vacancies had occurred in the summer or fall of the presidential election year, and not once has the Senate confirmed the nominee for these vacancies before the November election. In 4 of those cases, the president withheld. In both of the 2 instances where the president did insist, these circumstances, Edward Bradford in 1952, Abe Fortas in 1968, the Senate refused to confirm those elections. And so what he said is it's time to consider, and what should wait is that if there was an opening that ever occurred again in an election year, once primaries were in progress, you should wait until the elections, and then the sitting president would be able to finish the process post election. And again, there'll still be politics involved, but one of the things that Abe Fortas in 1968 was to replace Chief Justice Earl Warren. Abe Fortas was on the court, and there's a book by John Dean, the same John Dean that was involved in Watergate and had issues. And John Dean writes extensively about the process and about how Nixon and him as a candidate really made every effort to sandbag Abe Fortas. And Abe Fortas had some things. He was on retainer by someone that appeared before the court. There were some other things, but there was a lifetime $10,000 or $20,000 a year stipend that he was getting. And when we look in terms of what's happening today with, we've got several justices of the Supreme Court that have written books get major advances. Amy Coney Barrett's going to write a book for, and I think her advance is 2.1 million. And so in retrospect, it may have been not as big of an issue as at the time, but it's a fascinating history of Abe Fortas when you go back and look at that and read John Dean's book. And he was there. He was the one that was vetting. And then, so the Biden rule was in 1992. The McConnell Role was in 2016. As we all know, in an election year, we wait to hear what the public has to say about a president. And then the McConnell Reverse Role was in 2020. We, of course, because now we have a Senate that's aligned with the president, we go ahead and we immediately nominate someone and confirm them through the process. And so that's kind of where we're at. And so that's just, I just wanted to give a little bit of that kind of what's been happening. So that was in 2020, beginning of the October term. Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed in mid-October and became a justice. She did not participate in some of the first cases that were heard. And so she's not participated in those decisions as well. For those of you that follow the court yesterday, on Thursday, the court, in an opinion by Amy Coney Barrett, looked at the Consumer Fraud, Computer Fraud Access Act, I think it's called, the CFAA, and found that a police officer that had gone beyond and done things for non-professional purposes couldn't be indicted under that statute. So jump ahead, COVID-19 in the court, like everything has changed. And so COVID-19 impacted the court. When we first started having shutdowns and things in January, February, and March of last year, the court canceled a number of hearings in March and April, and then decided to live stream and do by telephone arguments in April and May. And they did hear a number of arguments during that period of time. Normally, the court would finish by June 30th. We'll see this year if they finished by June 30th. As mentioned, they still have 20 major opinions that they have to issue in the next few weeks. But last year, in June and July of 2020, normally what happens is that a number of justices want to get out of the District of Columbia. They teach far away, they go overseas, they take travel. Justice Clarence Thomas and his wife, Jenny Thomas, get in their RV and go around America and stay at Walmart lots to refresh and to charge their RV. But last year, June and July, of course, there was no overseas trips. There was nobody teaching classes or doing anything of that nature. And so they took their time and actually went into about the second week of July last year. We'll see what's happening this year, but it does seem like we're starting to get it back to normal. We're seeing, them issue opinions. They've got 2 opinion dates next week on Monday and Thursday. And so we'll see if they get through their agenda before the 4th of July holiday this year. The opening by the marshals changed a little bit. It used to say that everybody's admonished to draw near and give their attention. The draw near has been taken out if you listen into the live streams or to any of the tapes, and so that's different as well. Live hearings and last year in 2020, we heard the first toilet flush, heard during oral arguments. There was a great controversy about Flushgate and who was the person behind the infamous flush. The narrowing of it suggested it was Justice Breyer by process of elimination, but we don't know that for sure. It has a different tempo and style. So the old way of the Supreme Court is that the advocate would get up to the podium. In the last couple of years, even before COVID, Chief Justice Roberts instituted a new procedure where the first 2 minutes, the advocate can go up and talk without being interrupted. But after that 2 minutes, it used to be a free-for-all. And so you have 9 people up in the bench in close proximity, and you're standing at the front of the bench facing the Chief Justice and getting rapid fire questions. They changed that because of telephone and because of live streaming. That necessarily won't work well. Anybody that's been on any of these Zoom meetings knows that if people are talking over each other, nobody gets heard. And so what happened is they started asking questions by seniority. And by seniority, the only exception to that is that one of the few things, as we'll talk about in a minute, that the Chief Justice has as an absolute power is that by that position, regardless of the first day on the job, whether that person has been a justice before or not, that person has automatic seniority. And that's one of the benefits of being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. What they started to do is ask questions by seniority. So Chief Justice Roberts would go, and then Justice Thomas would go. The Chief Justice would keep in time, although there's mixed timekeeping by Roberts. A lot of these arguments are supposed to be 1 hour, and many of them are going substantially over. They might go 1 hour and 20 minutes because sometimes Roberts is not cutting off the questioner and the answers from the advocates. The thing that's most unusual and peculiar about this whole new method and asking questions by seniority is that Justice Thomas, many of you may or may not know, but for many years, there's been gaps of years where Justice Thomas never asked a single question from the bench. He's not a big believer in the benefits of oral arguments generally. And he might have something there because when you think about arguments by the time they get to the Supreme Court of the United States, there's an extensive record that exists. There's also briefs that are by the parties themselves. Oftentimes the government, the Solicitor General gets involved, or the Department of Justice on various matters. They file briefs. And then there's what's known as amicus briefs, which are friends of the court that talk about opinions of both sides. In some of these hotly contested cases that we'll hear next year, like in the concealed carry from New York, the Dobbs abortion case, in other cases like that, the Affordable Care Act case that will come out in the next few weeks here, there might be 50 or 60 amicus briefs. And so Thomas's view is that there's enough information there. Everybody's beat the law to death. They've stated their positions. But in this case, since they went to this oral live stream, Thomas has always asked questions. And so that's an interesting concept, and he asks good questions. And so a lot of people then will piggyback off of him because it goes in order of seniority. And so it's been an interesting process that way. What we don't know is when they go back to live oral arguments in October in the Supreme Court, I think that's where they're headed, whether or not we'll have live stream, number one, and number two, whether Chief Justice Roberts will continue to have this questioning by seniority, or if it will go back to the free-for-all that it was before. So stay tuned. The other thing that's been an interesting thing is technology, muting and unmuting. Again, they've gotten much better at this, but when they were first doing this in April and May of 2020, Breyer oftentimes had to call back in. Some of the advocates weren't muting or unmuting their phones. And so there's been a lot of things that have happened as a result of us all being in this Zoom or live streaming world that we live in right now. So the song remains the same for the October 2020 term. They haven't met in person, although the Supreme Court, the justices have met in Washington, D.C. There's their annual photo that's of the court. And in conferences now, they are in fact meeting in Washington, D.C., I believe, and deliberating. So they've heard numerous cases. There was this term, there was a yelling and a dog barking. That was when Justice Barrett first got in the court. And people believe that was probably her dog. She has dogs and a lot of kids. Interesting. Again, they were hearing these things, and we're seeing, and in some ways I like it because, again, I think one of the benefits of being on Zoom and working from home for those that work and interacting from home is that we're seeing people in their more natural setting instead of everybody being all formal. And so there's something nice about that, to see that these people, these justices are human and just regular people like everybody else. The courts decided 39 decisions to date, I believe it is now. There were numerous 9-0s during the last few weeks. That streak ended with the case that I mentioned earlier that Justice Barrett issued a 6-3 decision. But one of the things that, again, I think that the people have a perception that the court is substantially divided philosophically, jurisprudentially, and just by partisan lines. This court, like many courts preceding it, does have a majority of their cases that are 9-0 cases. A lot of them are statutory cases. A lot of them are cases that may not seem to be as impactful as some of the lightning rod cases that come out towards the end of every term that are the more social issues that we see the court deal with. There's a thing known as the shadow docket. The shadow docket is a term that somebody at the University of Chicago came up with a few years ago. And the shadow docket is a process where advocates, especially the government, and this was especially prevalent during President Trump's 4 years, would bypass the appellate courts and other processes and go directly to the Supreme Court for their answers. And so I just was looking at the chat. And there's also a coronavirus docket. The coronavirus docket is these cases that challenge on various bases the shutdowns of churches and other gatherings in California, Wisconsin, Texas, and other places. And that continues as well, although I think those will start to dissipate and go away. And the reason for that is that places like Illinois, we're getting back to full capacity and full attendance at events. The Wrigley Field, I think, for the Cubs has announced that it's now at full capacity and things like that. So there's Chief Justice John Roberts. And what I said towards the end of my book when I wrote it in 2019, actually this was written in 2018 because that's the publishing timeline. But what I said was, time will tell. The Roberts Court legacy will continue to be closely watched. If the reports of Roberts' strong interest in seeing the integrity of the judicial process maintained and the prestige upheld are true, watchers on both sides of the aisle might be disappointed by how Roberts and the court decide matters, end quote. And not that I'm the great prognosticator, but if you pay attention at all to, again, both sides, you'll see that Roberts has been skewered by the right when he, for example, in June Medical last year, concurred in the decision to uphold the Roe v. Wade and not to overturn a case from 2 years ago that the Supreme Court had decided. On the other hand, people will knock Roberts from the left when he does things, and we'll see what he does with the ACA in the coming weeks. But he has been somebody, and he's an interesting guy. He's very conservative, but at the same time, he does really have this kind of long-term perspective on this integrity of the judicial process and the legacy of the court and its credibility for future generations. And so time will tell. The jury is still out on the Roberts legacy. The other thing about the Chief Justices, as mentioned, they don't have very many roles, and we're going to talk about that in a second, but the Chief Justices over time, the really effective ones that when we look through history, and there's only been a handful of really effective drivers, in my opinion, on the Supreme Court that have sat in the center seat. One of the questions I get sometimes is, why is it 17 men? That's because there's only been to date 4 females that have been on the Supreme Court of the United States. Sandra Day O'Connor was the first one in 1981. And so at some point, one would expect when Chief Justice Roberts retires, could be decades away, that the sitting president, whomever she or he is at that time, may in fact nominate a female to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. But one of the things that the Chief Justice does in that central seat, the effective ones at least, is they pace the court and they try to maintain the court's prestige in the eyes of we the people. And again, time will tell if this court is now different. It doesn't appear so. And again, we see that in some of the ways in which the court has come out on decisions this year. Roberts, for the first time in his 15 plus years, was a sole dissenter in a case that was issued earlier this year. And so again, it may be that he is trying to keep the court out of the sticky thicket of controversial subjects and maybe losing that battle because there are 5 conservative associate justices on the court with the addition of Justice Barrett. What I also say about Roberts is don't expect him to be the new Kennedy, as some have described. And Kennedy, if you look at his record overall over the decades he served, he wasn't as much of a swing vote as people think. On same-sex, he was for sure, but in there aren't many other areas where Kennedy was really truly a swing vote. And again, maybe in Roe v. Wade, but he didn't often vote with the liberal bloc. Was mostly more of a libertarian, and so his decisions reflect that. And Roberts, again, won't be as broad, but see stare decisis. Stare decisis, if you don't know the term, is let the decision stand, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. Like I said, when he gets out of line, when Roberts does something, when there was the Pennsylvania 4-4 tie before Amy Coney Barrett got involved, this had to do with the election overturn. Schlapp called for him to be convicted and placed in jail for being treasonous, and in parlor in December called for the execution of the 7 justices who refused to do anything about the elections as well. Again, with Amy Coney Barrett in a more conservative court, his efforts for legitimacy and pacing might be more difficult because, again, the way it works in the court, there's 9 justices. Petitions for certiorari get filed, about 7,000 cases. Petitions get filed per year with the Supreme Court of the United States. In recent years, the Supreme Court has heard and decided about 65 substantive cases, 65, so it's about 1% or less. And what it takes to get a case to be granted cert and oral arguments to be held is it takes 4 justices to say that they will in fact go ahead and hear a case. And there are some cases like Dobbs, which is an abortion case out of Mississippi, that for 20 weeks from conference to conference, it got continued. There's a lot of speculation about why that in fact is the case. One speculation is that Roberts, again, was trying to find a way to prevent the court from having to deal with that issue, and especially as it comes into play, it would be decided in June of next year during the midterms. That's one theory. The other theory is that the 4 that were in favor of granting cert and hearing arguments wanted to make sure that they had a 5th vote in place to do whatever it is that the 4 that granted cert might in fact be thinking in that case. A few general things about the court. It tries to balance its load by justices. I find this fascinating how there's 9 justices, there's 63 or 64 opinions this year. The swing will be between probably 5, maybe for Amy Coney Barrett because she started late, and 9 opinions, but almost every justice will have 6 or 7 opinions that they were in the majority on. And again, it's fascinating that is the way it works. It's worked that way for several terms, and it's just fascinating that somehow these 9 justices can each find 7 or decisions where they're in the majority that they can write the opinions. And it's balanced out by year end. It's not a transparent process because what happens is the justices each week meet in conference. There's nobody in the room except the 9 justices. If anybody knocks or anything, the most junior justice, in this case, Justice Barrett, has to answer the door. And there's no recording of the deliberations. And again, we don't know how they go about this process. but it's that's the way it comes out. The last couple of terms have been the lowest productions in many years, and 61 decisions in the 2019 term that ended in July 2020. And part of the reason for that, again, was COVID and no hearings in February, March, and part of April. 64 decisions will be decided in the 2020 term. Again, those are below. It's hard to believe, but go back a few decades, and the court on average would do 120 to 150 opinions per year. The debates continue, and again, this is all the politics. And when Gorsuch ruled last year for transgender based on a statute and that on the basis of sex, the Federalist posted an article that was a firebound to the Constitution, and so the debate continues. So how did we get here? What in the heck? 232 years into the grand experiment are we doing? Not much was left by the founding fathers, at least when it came to the Supreme Court and how the judicial branch operated. The shortest of the articles in the Constitution, which is short in itself, is Article 3. Article 1 is the longest. Article 2 is the second longest. And then the third branch, Article 3, has 3 sections, one of which is not really related to the role of the judiciary. The first section, Section 1, gives the judicial power in the Supreme Court and such inferior courts as Congress shall enable. The enactment of the number of justices and things came through in the Judiciary Act of 1789, and there's been some changes since, but that's really where the number of judges, justices, and the number of courts that existed at the lower levels would be created. Section 2 gives judicial jurisdiction over certain matters. Most of it's discretionary, but there are some things that they have original jurisdiction over, very limited. And like I said, Section 3 is treason, but not really related to the role of the judiciary, except that treason is a crime, and so one of the few crimes that's enumerated in the Constitution of the United States. Judiciary, of course, is a co-equal branch of government, but there's one of the things, again, that drove me to the book and to provide something to make it accessible, not just to lawyers or judges, but really to everybody, whether you have any judicial training or not, or legal training, is this lack of access. We know a lot about the executive branch. We see it every day on the news. We know a lot about the legislative branch. We see everything on the news every day, and especially in this hyper-partisan 24/7 news cycle. Whatever your flavor of news is, turn on CNN, Fox, MSNBC, turn on your local news, and Meet the Press, This Week with George, whatever it is, Face the Nation, and you'll see the talking heads, right, of political parties. We see senators, we see reps, we see the executive branch and agencies, but the judicial branch, we really don't see much about at all. There's a lack of access. There's really a lack of knowledge of what takes place, and it's kind of it's a black box of what happens, and there's a lack of understanding. And what I always use as the example is if you go back to 2012, the Affordable Care Act case. If you remember, CNN and other reporters back in when things are live, what happened was there would be boxes of opinions over on the side. Reporters would all grab those, run out to the front steps, sprinting to the front steps where the cameras were. And on the Affordable Care Act case, first page says that the Affordable Care Act cannot withstand scrutiny under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And so CNN and others said, okay, Chief Justice Roberts has just written an opinion for the court that overturns the Affordable Care Act. Then turn the page, all the taxing power saves it, and lo and behold, we have an upholding of the Affordable Care Act. One of the things I say about lawyers in general and judges in particular is their writing style. They may be smart, but the damn opinions are often 20, 30, 40, 100 pages with dissents and concurrences. They're not very well written, at least from a digestibility standpoint of what the heck's going on with these cases. even if you read the syllabus on these cases that come out on a daily basis, like I do, and I follow it and report on them and write about the cases, very difficult to navigate through what the heck's in those writings. And so again, the judicial branch, which is a co-equal branch, is the least understood, the least transparent, the least open to us knowing what the heck's going on a regular basis. And one other thing, it's not related to the Supreme Court of the United States, but in Illinois, for example, again, the judicial branch is a co-equal branch. There are courts in every county of the state, co-equal branch, and yet I think the budget for the judicial branch of Illinois gets about 1 to 3% of the overall budget as a co-equal branch of government. And think about that when you think about the judicial branch. In many ways, a lot of it gets paid for by filing fees and other court costs. But in any event, I digress. So Article 3, again, was the lightest wording. Again, this lack of access or understanding. The founders, when they were getting to the judiciary, they wanted a judicial branch, but they were pretty confident in that not being the real part of the debates and discussion about how this Constitution was going to go together. And so again, if you look at the Constitution, there's 3 sections, page or 2 in the Constitution. Of the 4,700 original words, I think it's 300 or 400 words total that are in Article 3. As I mentioned already, the Judiciary Act of 1789 addressed that. It created 6 justices and in inferior courts. We'll talk about the number of justices historically, and then there's the number who have served. There's 102 associate justices, I think the number is, and there are 17 chief justices. And I may be off a little bit on associate justices because there have been several associate justices that became chief justices. There's been 5 in our history. So what is this chief justice again, and where does he get his power? The only reference in the Constitution is to a chief justice is the impeachment of a president. And as we all know from the impeachment of President Trump and President Clinton before him, the impeachment of the president, the Constitution says the chief justice shall preside. And again, that's the only reference to a chief justice. That's the only reference to justice, by the way. And there are many people, including William Bauer, who is the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals judge in Chicago. And I know very well he's 91 or 92, I believe. And he pulls out his Constitution that he carries in his breast pocket all the time. And when you see him and talk to him, he says there's no such thing as justices. We're all just judges. And this is invented out of whole cloth. But it's not, the Chief Justice position is not well defined in the Judiciary Act either. I refer to it like Animal Farm in the book. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And one of the things that Justice Roberts has done is we used to just have justices from 1 to whatever the current number was. He changed the numbering system, and he again has made them more equal than others by having the chief justices numbered separately from the justice numbers that traditionally had been the case. So the chief justice, there are several functions and duties. The chief justice sits over the overall judicial conference. The chief justice has some honorary roles, is the president of the Smithsonian Institute, for example. Has, other than that, not a whole lot. But again, has that seniority built in, speaks first in conference. And if the chief justice is in the majority after voting in conference, the chief justice can again takes on that senior role and can assign the opinion to whatever justice is in the majority. And some have used that to more extensively than others. Chief Justice Warren Burger, for example, there's a lot of literature about him. He would change his views and positions, and so he could assign the opinions. And a lot of the justices bristled. There's a book called The Brethren that was written about his court by Bob Woodward of Watergate fame. And he talks extensively. A lot of people leaked during that time. But again, the biggest role that the Chief Justice plays is this kind of pace setter, this temperature control, kind of keeping a finger up in the wind to see where the wind's blowing in terms of societal, to the extent that that influences, and this ability to influence. The most effective in the court's history, there's probably 3 or 4 that I would suggest. The first is Chief Justice John Marshall, who by force of will, and I write about it in the book extensively, was able to get majority unanimous opinions. One of the justices who dissented in one case, Johnson, immediately said that it was the most difficult thing, and he never did it again in his history of his tenure on the court with Chief Justice John Marshall. Charles Evans Hewes in the 1930s, probably the second most effective justice in this regard. And the reason I say that is he had a very divisive court. This was during the first court packing debates that happened in the 1930s with FDR's New Deal. And he had Felix Frankfurter, who was a very cantankerous and difficult justice. He would try to get people under his wing, and when they bristled against that, he would then become agitated and fight against those individuals. But he was able to kind of cohesively get that court to save 9, the switch in time to save 9, and to deal with the 9 scorpions in the bottle, as Holmes once referred to the justices. The third probably, or I'm not sure how you rank them, would be Earl Warren. And why do I say that? Earl Warren came to the court in the fall of 1953. In the spring of 1953, Brown versus Board of Education had been heard, and Felix Frankfurter and others pushed once Chief Justice Vinson died, to push back until the fall of 1953, re-arguments in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. There are reports that are very credible that if Vinson Court had decided the case, or if Warren was not successful in the politicking that he did with the court, that Plessy would have been upheld by a 5-4 decision based on kind of the pulse of the court, including Justice Clark himself. So in any event, those are probably the 3 most effective in our court's history. Let's talk a little bit about the Chief Justices and the title of my book, and very quickly we'll go through these folks. John Jay was our first Chief Justice. He served for about 6 years. He resigned to become governor of New York. He also went over to work on, while he was still Chief Justice, again, different times. We had several of these justices doing things that were extrajudicial, that are now frowned upon. The closest we could come to that in recent years would probably be Earl Warren and the Warren Commission on the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But John Jay left. He entered on behalf of the United States, Jay's Treaty, and when he was asked by President Adams to come back, he declined it. He said there was no prestige, no gravitas to serving on the Supreme Court of the United States, and there was nothing to do. He thought it was a boring task. And in fact, if you look at the first 3 Chief Justices here, Jay, Rutledge, and Ellsworth, those 3 courts over the first 12 years, decided a total of 61 cases. Many of those had to do with Native American rights. Many of those had to do with territorial disputes and land boundaries and water usage. And so a court that was doing a lot to get ready, but you think about the controversies that would have emerged in those early years, and especially for John Jay, there weren't tons of things to try to resolve, just because, again, there weren't disputes that were ready for coming to the court. The other thing that turned off, I think, some of the, not only the chiefs, but the associate justices back in the beginning, is that they wrote circuits. And so they would be assigned to the various circuits that existed. There were, I believe, 3 circuits at the beginning. And they would ride these and go to appellate courts and hear cases as colleagues with the justices from the district courts around their circuits. And so John Jay left. John Rutledge was his replacement. John Rutledge was a recess appointment. John Rutledge had been an associate justice and resigned to become the Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court. John Rutledge was an interesting man. He, as I said, was a recess appointment. He was selected in August of 1795 by President George Washington. Jay's Treaty came in around that time, and John Rutledge, on his way through South Carolina, heading to New York, engaged in a protest, and had said that it would be better off that George Washington was dead than to sign this horrible treaty. John Rutledge got up to the Capitol, and in December, when the Senate got back into session, John Rutledge became the first Supreme Court nominee to be rejected by the Senate by a vote of 12-14. John Rutledge went home in shame to South Carolina, and strong, credible evidence was that he walked into the river that was on his plantation or near his plantation and attempted suicide, and 2 of his slaves rescued him from drowning. And part of John Rutledge as well, sadly, his wife and his mother both died around that same time. And so John Rutledge retired from public service and was never heard from again. John Rutledge, though, was an important person because he was very involved in the designing and drafting of the Constitution. He was one of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, as was Oliver Ellsworth. And those two, probably as much as any other 2 people from our founders and from those that approved the Constitution and submitted to the states, are responsible for the design. They were in the committee of detail, and other ones that put these various resolutions into what we know today as the Constitution of the United States. Oliver Ellsworth then was selected. Oliver Ellsworth was in for a few years. Oliver Ellsworth was the first person, although John Marshall gets credit for it, to write unified opinions to the extent possible. Oliver Ellsworth also issued some decisions in his short tenure that really were precursors to Marbury versus Madison. And then John Marshall, on the eve of John Adams leaving the presidency, he tried again to get John Jay. He tried to get others to assume the Chief Justice position, and then turned to his Secretary of State, John Marshall. John Marshall was the Secretary of State, Marbury versus Madison, which talked about judges and not getting their papers before the deadline. John Marshall's responsible for that. He and his brother James Marshall failed to deliver those judicial positions. And in any event, John Marshall was nominated, and for a short period of time served not only as Secretary of State but as Chief Justice of the United States. John Marshall, I mentioned recent revisiting, and as was said at the beginning, my law school, the John Marshall Law School, recently voted, the Board of Trustees of the University of Illinois system voted to change the name and remove the name John Marshall. There was a petition by students. John Marshall, as was not unusual for his time, he was a Virginian, and he owned 200 slaves, and so there's that in his past. There's also his treatment of Native Americans and some of his decisions of the court in those days, and there's also There were some decisions that were made and some cases that were decided that had to do with mostly DC slave issues. And so in any event, John Marshall, there's been a revisiting of him. There's still the Chicago Tribune and the Wall Street Journal issued op-eds saying that he still really stands for the rule of law and established the prestige of the Supreme Court of the United States. So difficult issues that we're dealing with John Marshall. He was replaced by Roger Taney. Taney served during the period from 1835 to 1864. So pretty much the entire time that the battle ensued over slavery, with the 1850 Compromise and with his Dred Scott opinion, that's considered one of the worst opinions in the history of the Supreme Court. And I write about in my book, Roger Taney, when he was Attorney General, he wrote several other opinions that should have given an inkling of how he would have ruled on a case like Dred Scott. He was replaced by Salmon Chase. Chase served at the beginning of the end of the Civil War and the ends of Reconstruction, followed by Waite and Fuller, and then by Edward White. And if you read the book, or if you look at the footnotes in the book, my son John, who's a 2019 Monmouth Fighting Scott graduate, was my editor, and he observed that there was kind of a lull really between John Marshall and then these justices. That not a lot happened in the court other than they took a very narrow view of the 14th Amendment, and they interpreted in ways that potentially were at odds with what the intent of the 14th Amendment was. And then the first former president in our history took over, William Howard Taft. Interestingly, Charles Evans Hewes, who succeeded him, was promised the Chief Justice position by William Howard Taft when Taft was president, but Charles Evans Hewes resigned in 1916 to run for president. And so when he had an opportunity to potentially put Hewes in place, when Edward White was chosen, many have predicted or thought that Taft was looking ahead. Taft was a judge on the Sixth Circuit out of Cincinnati, Ohio. And when you read about Taft, the thing I think that's probably the most interesting about Taft is that he was not interested in the presidency. He never really wanted to be president. He loved being a judge. And so this is what he really wanted. And so there's strong arguments that he put White in place because White was old and he knew that White wouldn't last very long and he would get to be Chief Justice potentially. And lo and behold, he did. And then Charles Evans Hewes came in. Charles Evans Hewes served, and then Stone and Vincent. Earl Warren served during the Red Scare and during desegregation, replaced by Warren Burger, who surprisingly resigned to become the president of the Bicentennial Commission. There's stories, and I write about it in the book, that when Warren Burger was in 1986, he asked for a meeting with President Reagan. Reagan was fretful because every time he met with Warren Burger was asking for more money for the judicial system. And what Burger wanted to tell him was he was resigning to become chair and president of the Bicentennial Commission. He was replaced by William Rehnquist, who was an associate justice, and now we have John Roberts. Let's talk quickly about the role the courts played. Some have asserted the court's anti-majoritarian. When you look back in history, there's few examples of that really being the case. There's a lot of talk. When Scalia was around, he talked extensively about how the court did this a lot. But there's very few instances really where the court in the last 60 or 70 years has really been this anti-majoritarian court where they've gone against the majority of elected officials and overturned or did things socially that were adverse to what the legislative bodies of the states and the federal might do. It's the final arbiter of constitutionality. As I mentioned, there's ebbs and flows of the court. There's the Lochner area, which was laissez-faire. they let everything go. Pretty much anything could happen. There's been other periods. And again, the role the court has played stems from Marbury versus Madison and its grand design. There has to be a tiebreaker. And what better branch than the one that doesn't have any power of the purse or the sword, but has the power of the pen only. We'll just go, and again, we're not going to spend any time on this. Number of justices historically, it's been as low as 6 in 1789. It got as big as 10 in 1863 when the 10th Circuit was established. There's now 13 federal circuits, but we only have 9 justices. In 1866, it was reduced to 7. The reason for that was that they did not want President Johnson to be able to replace any justices in the created court. And then it was expanded to 9 in 1869, and it's been the same ever since. If you're paying any attention, there's a Supreme Court Commission that the Biden administration has put in place. None of the court packing or expansion plans or term limits have any chance of passing in the current Congress, but there are efforts afoot. One of the interesting things I think that again, looking at the courts over time, this is overturns of constitutional precedents by Chief Justice. Roger Taney did 1, not a lot. Warren Burger did 35. As of current, Warren Burger has the most overturning of constitutional precedents of any Chief Justice. Roberts is at 20 plus and counting. The thing that's unusual about Roberts is that most of the cases that are overturned have been from the 70s and more recent. The last 100 years, I'm not going to again go into details about that, but some interesting things if you look there. And again, some of the changes we've had. I want to spend a quick minute on dark money. 20 million was spent on the first 3 nominees opposing Garland for Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. There was about $10 million that was spent on the Amy Coney Barrett for her confirmation. I don't know about you, but I'm troubled by that because most people are not altruistic when it comes to politics and when it comes to putting people on the bench. Not that these people, the justices, when they get there, aren't somewhat independent, but to me, that's very troubling that we have this kind of money spilling into campaigns to support these nominees to the branch that's supposed to be the nonpartisan, non-political branch of government. I talked about stare decisis and things decided. There are several factors for when the court will overturn. They've talked about it extensively. There's a lot of fighting that takes place now in the current couple of terms amongst the justices about stare decisis and about overturning precedents. The most recent was a case that Kavanaugh wrote the majority opinion on. It had to do with the ability of juveniles to rehabilitate themselves, and I think it was that one, or maybe it's been the unanimous juries for criminal cases. In any event, Justice Kagan in dissent wrote a pretty scathing attack on Kavanaugh and his majority opinion for not coming to the rescue as he said he would. I think again it was in the non-unanimous jury's case. And we'll see more of that. And so again, we didn't see it for a while. Chief Justice Scalia, when he was alive and around, would often fight and do things, but he's not done it as much. And I'll answer that question in a minute. We're going to speed ahead here and get through. Again, the fight's coming out, so we'll see more. We see a court that's not consistently rigidly for conservative causes. Trump was successful at one more conservative justice. We don't know what we'll see in the coming years. One of the things that, again, over the last many years, since October term 1971, the court's been either equally divided when Scalia's vacancy existed, or there's been a majority of Republican appointed justices. And one of the things I tell people, I think a lot of people think that Earl Warren was the Chief Justice when Roe v. Wade was decided. But when that was decided, it was 7-2 with 3 Law and Order President Richard Nixon justices. including Chief Justice Warren Berger, Justices Harry Blackmun and Lewis Powell, and 2 other Republican appointees, Potter Stewart and William Brennan. So 5 of the 7 votes were Republican nominated. The last Chief Justice appointed by a Democrat was Chief Justice Fred Vincent. He was appointed in 1945. He died in 1953. And so we've had Republican appointed Chief Justices for the last 70 almost years. The last Democratic nominated justice confirmed by a Senate with a majority of Republicans was 1895. Rufus Peckham was confirmed, and President Grover Cleveland's nominee. So good Trivial Pursuit questions, right? Again, court packing, unpacking, we'll continue to see this transpire. And so with that, I will stop the presentation and we will go to the questions. Let's see here.
Perfect.
There was something in chat. Here we go.
Yes.
Michelle, hey Michelle, how are you? Do you see the presence of dark money increasing for future justice nominations? I do, and it will continue. I think there have been a lot of discussion lately. If you've been looking in the press, a lot on the left have been pushing Justice Breyer to retire. That the last time that this potential happened was in Ruth Bader Ginsburg when Barack Obama was president. And again, we have a very closely divided Senate here. So I think if Breyer were to announce his retirement, I think that there would be, like there was with Merrick Garland, there would be substantial money from the right to say, wait until 2022 and let's see what happens. Because I just think that's the case. I don't think a Senate Judiciary Committee that's equally divided will pass forward and approve anybody that's not a centrist or to the right. And so I do see dark money, unfortunately, continuing. There are a lot of things. Again, Abe Fortas, what happened with him in 1968, he was wrong, but think about the last, again, 40 years. Think about where Justice Scalia died. He was at a ranch down in Texas of the ancient Hibernians, on an all expense paid trip to go hunting. We see honorariums. We see, again, Justice Gorsuch has written a book. Amy Coney Barrett's writing a book. They're getting substantial money from those. And Putnam, which is the producer and publisher of Amy Coney Barrett's book, they have substantial number of cases before the Supreme Court every year on free speech and First Amendment, and they're amicus in many cases. So I do see dark money, unfortunately, continuing. And at the state level, it's horrendous as well. In Illinois, Justice Kilbride, there were millions of dollars spent to unseat him. Monmouth was within his judicial circuit, and he lost his retention race. One of the few judges in the 50 years that we've been doing retention voting in Illinois to lose his seat. And again, there was millions of dollars spent, and I find that wrong because, again, I don't know about you, but nobody's spending tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to just be altruistic and to support somebody that they think, if you don't think that they've got an expectation that's existing behind that, I've got a bridge to sell you.
Excellent question, Michelle. So as you can see, some folks have their cameras on, others don't. That's totally fine. At this time, if you've got any questions for Dan or just any conversation you guys would like to discuss, now's the time. The floor is yours.
Feel free to ask anything. No, don't be bashful. Come on, Monmouth College people, not, not.
It looks like we've got a question in the chat from Nick. Um, he says, Dan, thanks for a very comprehensive presentation. Concerning the dark money and your background in data privacy and cybersecurity, what is needed?
Well, I think one of the things that would be needed is to figure out who's behind these organizations, which is very, very difficult to do. In fact, there's a case that will be decided in the next few weeks by the Supreme Court, Americans for Prosperity and Thomas More Society, and it's a challenge to the California requirements that nonprofits disclose all of their donors, and they're harking back to the NAACP case versus Alabama from the 50s that talked about customer lists and the chilling effect that that has. And so, frankly, the only way that I think we get rid of this dark money would be to overturn and remove Citizens United and the kind of just explosion of money that's going into these things. But I don't think it's going to happen. Leo, what's his last name, from the Federalist Society, he started 2 years ago or 3 years ago a new PAC, a new nonprofit that's been funded with $80 million that talks about changing the judiciary at the nationwide level. And again, we don't have any idea where that $80 million comes from.
Perfect. We've got a question from Andy Kerr. Do you see any packing of the court in the next few years from either the right or the left?
Great question. I don't think court packing will happen, just like it failed in the 1930s for a lot of reasons. I think part of it is that this is something that has to, as long as the filibuster's around, there's not going to be 60 votes. We're not going to have a Senate. I don't think that's 60 one party. And I just don't see this happening. Like I said, the Biden administration has this commission, this bipartisan commission that will make some recommendations. There's nothing wrong with it, as the one slide indicated. About 6 or 7 times in the court's history, Congress has changed the number of judges or justices that sit on the Supreme Court. But I just don't see it happening. And I'm not a big fan of it. I think it's a slippery slope. In the book and in other writings, I've talked about the elimination of the nuclear option by Harry Reid in 2013 to get district court and appellate court judges nominated and confirmed. And there's some justification for it, but there's been probably bad behavior on both party sides. George W. Bush nominated some folks that sat around forever and never got confirmed as well. And so I think it's a slippery slope, because if you say that we go to 13 like they say now you have 13, and then a Republican gets back in the White House and you have a Republican Senate, you add 4 more, and then you get to a body as big as the Senate or as the House, right? You have 435 justices. I do think there's some ways, rather than packing, that you can do some things like term limits, although term limits is a challenge because judges are given for the office they hold lifetime tenure. Theoretically, you could invoke, there's a statute that, for example, former Justice David Souter retired under, where he's still considered a justice, but he can't hear and sit on the Supreme Court. You can put them in senior status, like happens in some of the lower benches. But again, I don't think there's appetite for that either. I just don't think in this current Senate, I don't think that that's going to happen with the court packing. Could it happen? Yeah, but I'm not a big fan of it. I don't think it. I think if we go that route, and if it did happen, I think then this kind of pace setting and this prestige and legacy that I was talking about that Roberts is very intent on kind of goes to the wayside, because then you're just admitting that this is a political body and that these people are, expected to vote red or blue on matters of note.
Perfect. We've got a couple more questions coming in. This one from Jim Wilson. Do you see evidence of bipartisanship where one judge will say, if you lean this way for me, I'll lean this way for you?
And there's a little bit of evidence of that, but not a whole ton. As I mentioned, Justice Kennedy was kind of the swing vote that occasionally would caucus. I think that the decision, the opinion by Justice Barrett yesterday was interesting because it had the 3 liberal justices and Amy Coney Barrett and who else? Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, I think, were in it. So a strange bedfellows type of a decision that does happen sometimes. But I think on the lightning rod issues of the day, I don't think we're going to see much bipartisanship. I think that happens maybe more at the appellate level and at the district court level, well, at the appellate level. And there is some evidence. I do think the one way that things do get tempered a bit, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg talked about this a lot. She was known as a great dissenter, as was Scalia, is that sometimes you might get a little softening of the opinion and a much narrower opinion to either get a coalition or to avoid the nasty dissent. And so she wrote about that often, that she used the dissent sometimes to change people's minds. Brennan did that as well. And then Brennan, when he was on the court in the 70s, oftentimes would not file his dissent if the majority would kind of narrow their reach of their opinion.
Excellent. We have another question from Alice Dunlap Craft. How do you think history will look upon the McConnell Rule and the McConnell Reverse Rule? And also, is that a public term or is that your own term?
The McConnell Rule is a term that is out there in the public, and that was his rule. That's what it's known by. I think history will not reflect well on Mitch McConnell in general. Why do I say that? I think if we look at the last several Congresses, they're the least productive in the history of Congresses. There's not much of substance that takes place in any 4-year term. Think about Trump's 4-year term. What was accomplished? The tax rollback, right? What else? What other major thing happened there? And why is that? Because he refuses to place things on the floor and things of that nature. So I don't think history will reflect well upon it. And I think it's unfortunate the way that those things were handled. I think, again, going back to Kennedy was nominated in 1987, but he was actually confirmed in February of 1988. And so if you followed the McConnell Rule back in those days, and by a Democratic Congress, and he was unanimously confirmed, but that was the lame duck year of Ronald Reagan's second term. So again, there's all this talk that there's never been this situation, it's never happened before. You can go back to Kennedy and say he was confirmed in an election year, in a lame duck year, by the opposite party Senate. So, we'll see how history reflects. But again, I'm personally not a fan of McConnell. I think this thing with the January 6th commission. I mean, he on January 6th got on the floor of the Senate and talked about what was going on. And now, because he sees it as a potential losing of votes and counting heads, he's now asked as a personal favor that the Republicans not vote for the bipartisan commission. So that's my view of McConnell. Not that if you read the Master of the Senate about LBJ and some of his corruptness, or Harry Reid, or anybody that's been Senate Majority Leader, but in this case, I don't think that it'll be reflected upon well, and I think it's done permanent harm and damage to the process, because every time now that we have a situation, again, really 2 seats flipped because of this whole invented roles that he created. And so there you have it. And again, for the history thing, Rufus Peckham, 1895, the last time a Republican Senate approved a democratically nominated nominee. And we're going to see it again if Breyer does retire or something happens to Breyer. I guarantee you, mark my words, that there will be no replacement that is confirmed for Joe Biden if he gets that opportunity this year, next year, even if the Senate goes to a different place. But right now with the 50-50 majority, if in 2022 the Republicans sort of take over and it happened then, I would put money on it that we will not see any nominee confirmed by that Senate.
Perfect, thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat at this time. Did anybody have any questions or comments that they wanted to verbally discuss? Okay, so I'll do a couple of announcements. I'll check the chat to see if there's any other questions or comments in there, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. So tomorrow's going to be a very busy day for our Golden Scots. We kick off the day at 10 a.m. with a presentation on World War II from our college historian, Jeff Rankin. Following that, we will have a tour of the Putnam Museum with their curators, a presentation titled Going to the Moon from Attacking Corporate Crime to Playing Live Gigs with Bill Makastad, class of 73. And then we'll be ending the evening with our virtual happy hours. You can check out the times, the links, all the information for each of those events on the Monmouth College website when you go to the Golden Scots tab. Also, today we released that we're going to be doing a morning session for our Fighting Scots golf outing. So if anyone's interested in participating, that information is also available on our website and social media. I don't see any other questions coming through. So at this time, I just want to say thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And thank you, Dan, for putting together such a great presentation.
Thank
Go
you.
Scots.
Thank you. Go Scots.
Thank you.
You all.